All the really important stuff is going to get on the board, and you can take notes, or you can watch the video again later. It will be there. I will also put a little cheater document, a little document that will list the summary, and we will post that in place of the slides. So don't worry. There is structure here. I know that for people who are hyper-visual, things which are spoken have no structure, only when there's an outline. But trust me, don't worry. So we've got several different things to do today. The major segments are going to be discussing the homework from yesterday. Then we're going to talk something about the overall principles of construction grammar of every kind. And then I'm going to tell you a little bit about the space of construction grammars. Somewhere in there, probably just after our break, after you've been introduced to the principles of construction grammar that hopefully most of you have heard of before, we are going to do a very free-form exercise in which I'm going to ask you to think of some sentences that we should be able to model using construction grammar. And if I don't get the diversity that I want, I will suggest some sentences, and then we'll work through them using the principles, okay? So keep in mind, you're going to be asked for some examples that we should talk about. Okay. Let's see. So first I should confess that I come from a particular variety of construction grammar. It's not surprising. I am most wedded to two possible theories. I'm happy with either of them. One of them is what we can call sign-based construction grammar, and I will give this to you in more detail later. But the principles that are followed by all of the construction grammars are close enough to each other that I don't think that this is going to be too distracting. But I will say this, that sign-based construction grammar and the Berkeley construction grammar that it arose from, those are the two theories that I'm wedded to because those are the theories that Chuck Fillmore helped to develop, are maximally different in a lot of ways from the construction grammar, the cognitive construction grammar developed by Adele Goldberg. So if all you are familiar with is the sort of Goldberg approach to construction grammar, I'm going to be talking a very different language today. Okay? So just to prepare yourself a little bit for that. Okay. So from the principles, the principles that I have on the board are sort of a summation of what Charles Fillmore recommends when analyzing language. And he was already recommending this before construction grammar was created, and in fact, construction grammar is in part an outgrowth from this idea. So the first thing to note, which is quintessentially Fillmorian, is that all language is fair game. That doesn't mean you have to simultaneously study all of language. That's not possible. But it does mean that you shouldn't draw a line and say, well, you know, my construction seems to be dependent on intonation patterns, but that's not my job. Or, my construction seems to be dependent on a particular construct of culture. Like, for example, if I say, if I say please in English, most foreign speakers don't realize that this, in the usual case, actually implies a power imbalance. So it is the person who has power who says please, and the person that is being asked who actually has less power. So please is something your boss says in America, not something you say to your boss. So if in theories prior to construction grammar, you would say, yeah, okay, I mean, sure, whatever, you know, but that's somebody else's problem. Let the anthropologist or sociologist worry about that. Well, that's, you know, okay as a methodology for people who don't actually want to figure out how things work. But if we actually want to know how to use language, we can't draw strict lines. Now, we might give a very sketchy account, right? We might not give the account that a sociologist would give of power dynamic, but we should at least note that there is that problem and not omit it from our description entirely. So this means that because everything is fair game, that means that we have to be really clear on how things get used. This is how we get entangled with corpus linguistics. Because it's very hard to know what all of the constraints are on language without looking at a ton of examples of whatever it is you're trying to explain. So that's not actually one of the principles. Corpus linguistics is not, I would say, a principle of construction grammar, but it is a conclusion, a more or less inevitable conclusion of the idea that we have. It's also enabled by our view of language, because if you have a, let's just say, for sake of argument, a hyper-Chomskyan position, then the fact that a lot of the stuff in the corpus is not stuff that you think people should say. You know, that there's something slightly weird about the grammar of what they did in the corpus. Well, for a lot of sort of hyper-Chomskyan people, that makes corpus study very unattractive, because they don't want to study what people actually say. They want to study what people ought to say, in some sense. And not in the old prescriptive sense, but still, they want to study subtracting out what they like to think of as performance errors and ignoring any structure that might occur in those performance errors. That's also not something that we would want to do from my viewpoint, for a Berkeley construction grammar viewpoint. The second point, which is related to that, is that we want to first model surface patterns. So what that means is we look at actual examples again. We look at, you know, what are the words that people use. So just to choose one very straightforward example, if we're looking at the verb give, and we want to know how it is that we can talk about the meaning of give, which is in the giving frame, the very straightforward, I have something and then you have something later kind of idea, then I should treat all of the possibilities for realizing those arguments as sort of on the same footing, right? So they're all just possibilities. And only after that should I look at them and see if some of them can be explained by other phenomena, right? So, for example, if I have a sentence like, I was given a book, we don't take the passive construction which gives you this sentence for granted. What we say is, Well, what I know for sure is that this is the subject, the external argument. And then here I have an object, and I can assign the grammatical roles, the semantic roles to these two things. I is, of course, the recipient, and book is, of course, the theme. And I also should realize, as a speaker of the language, that there's another element, the giver, which is not expressed in the sentence. And I should, of course, compare this with other sentences that involve those same ideas and the word give, right? So I should try to generalize, and I should keep generalizing, as I say here, until I would predict patterns that aren't right. So I certainly should compare this to other verbs and see that the same pattern applies. And given that the same pattern where you take something which is, you have an alternation between something which appears just after the verb as a direct object or just before the verb as a subject, well, that I can generalize over that, right? And there's a whole bunch of other entangled facts that go together with passive construction. It has also a semantic effect on the level of profiling of the various roles involved. That whole thing we want to describe, but we want to describe it from the bottom up. And that's important because that means that when we hit examples where things don't quite work the same, so let's take, for the moment, let's take something like rumor. The verb to rumor in English is a little bit peculiar, and probably not all of you are familiar with it. So you use it in sentences like, he was rumored to be coming to the university. So the president was rumored to be coming to the university. You cannot use it in an active sentence. So I can't say, I rumored the president to be coming to the university. That's not possible, right? Even, I mean, of course I can start a rumor, but then I have to say it that way. I have to say I started a rumor that the president was coming to the university. This fact is well motivated, right? I mean, rumors usually are not attributable to a specific source. That's what makes a rumor. But it's actually grammatically required. So even if you had a situation where a rumor was specifically attributable to somebody, you still can't do it. So what I would say is that you have to write your passive construction in such a way that not every passive sentence can be turned into an active. So it's clearly passive. It has all the right semantic characteristics to be a passive. He was rumored to be coming. You know, he is some kind of reprofiled entity, and that's very clear. But in point of fact, what I would say is that you actually want to write your construction for rumor to include the passive as part of its description. So now you have another entity, which is the gestalt, the combination of the general passive construction and a specific lexical construction, rumor. And when you entangle them that way, then that means that you don't have to say something about, well, it could also be active. Well, the only rumor that exists in your language, in this case, is a rumor that is already pre-packaged with the passive. Okay? So that's the second principle. The third principle is to posit, basically to posit syntax only when you need something that you don't get from generalizing form or meaning. So in the passive construction that I just talked about, I referenced the idea of a direct object. So why did I do that? Well, because really that's the level of description that's correct. But what about, for example, you may have heard of the easy construction, also known in other theories as tough movement. That's for sentences like, she is easy to talk to. So if I have a sentence like she is easy to talk to, then normally you would expect something to be right there, right? You'd expect the addressee frame element to be completed by a noun phrase there. But instead, it's semantically, that role is semantically identified with the she, which is over here. But you can notice that I can just as easily have a sentence, let me write it over here. She's easy to like. And now here we can see that the syntactic role of the thing which would, in other circumstances, appear here is not the same as the syntactic role here. So we shouldn't posit anything about syntax for what entity it is that shows up here when combined with easy. In fact, it's been explained pretty nicely recently by some work by Adele Goldberg, that the right way to think about this kind of connection is that you take the topic wherever it appears, but the subtopic of this chunk, and that's the thing that's going to appear over here. That's actually a reference to the discourse level, not a syntactic level. So when you are talking about the easy construction or tough movement, you should say that the identification of the subject of easy is with whatever is the topic, wherever that appears in the subordinate phrase. Okay? So in this case, we didn't have to posit any syntax. Everything that is connected here is all identified on the semantic level or the discourse level, the discourse prominence level. Okay? Okay. So now I'm just going to go through a bunch of examples of analysis to give you guys a little bit more of a feel for what these principles are supposed to be. So there's a bunch of different things that people want to do with construction grammar all the time. The most popular is modeling idioms. And it's sort of obvious in a way that you would want to use construction grammar for this because if you wanted to do it in some other theory, there just isn't any way. So I prefer to think of it sort of the other way around. Everybody who wants to talk about idioms does construction grammar because they don't have any other option. But it should be really clear from the fact that I'm talking about really basic constructions, passives, and the easy construction, that construction grammar is not primarily about modeling idioms. And in fact, the most important thing from my viewpoint is that it smoothly integrates from the most specific level all the way up to the most general. So that there were previous theories of idioms, but they didn't say anything about general language. So one example we could look at in a little bit more detail is, let's look at the easy construction. So if I say, I can also say, okay, so if I've got sentences like these, you should be able to immediately see some things which are in common across these sentences. Okay? So I'm going to ask people to give me a couple of examples of what's in common. And we're going to see if we can turn this into a construction description. So can we start, let's say, in the front over on this side? Can you name something which is in common across these examples?
The preposition to.
Okay, that's one example. Pass the microphone. I will correct that that's not actually a preposition in English, but don't worry about it. The word is in common, that's true.
Está em todas, isso é verdade.
Eu acho que...
I believe the subject and the agent, she, the book, the bacon, skills. Então, esses são os sujeitos. The agent.
What do you mean? You mean these are agents? They're not all agents.
Eles não são todos agentes.
Melhor sujeito.
I think they are all subjects.
They are all subjects,
Eles
that's
são
for
todos
sure.
sujeitos, com certeza.
Well, we'll start with that.
Vamos começar por aqui, então.
Okay, so they're all
Certo?
externals.
Então, eles são todos externos.
Okay, somebody have something else? Yes.
I mean, they are. One thing that's common is either easy. No. I don't know. Maybe the verb to be.
Okay,
They're always verbs
that's
to
for
be.
sure. Okay. Pass back.
I think all the structure is similar because we have a subject, the verb to be,
Yeah.
an adjective, and another verb. I think in both of the sentences the structure is the same.
What about this one?
E essa aqui?
A preposition. No, 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 no.
É uma preposição, não, não.
Yeah.
Turn off your speaker
Oh, okay.
because it's directly connected to your microphone.
Sorry. Okay. It's a good point. This is definitely an adjective, regardless of which one. There are several different kinds, but that's definitely an adjective. And this thing is always a verb. There's always a to, there's always a verb. But now we have to generalize a little bit. Pass the microphone.
Can you repeat, please?
So-
What do you mean by generalize?
So clearly, we can say that all of this is here, right? We've already done some generalizing,
Yeah.
right? This is a general category. This is a general category,
Yeah.
right? This is a general category. We'll also make a correction, right? It's not just a verb, right? I mean, this is a verb. This
Is
is
it
a
the
verb.
infinitive?
What's that?
The infinitive?
Yes, we can be more specific. We can say it's an infinitive. What if I said, so I can say that too. I can say she's easy to please with flowers. Does that make sense to people? Okay. Now what do I have? It's not just a verb, right? There's some other stuff. What should I call this category? Well, let me just say this whole chunk is something. What's a syntactic label?
I believe that the pattern is that the object on the second verb becomes the subject to be verb.
Okay, that is a true observation, that this subject applies to this verb, except that it doesn't apply as subject, right? It applies as object. So, good. So this thing is also, in this example, it is the object. So one could draw a line here saying object. Okay? But that's not true of all of them. It's true of this one. It's true of this one. But what about this one? We keep having trouble with this one. So I will say that the spot that you would expect something is there, but that's not a direct object of the verb, right? Okay? Pass the microphone. Is there something else that we can generalize here?
I don't know. You have asked about please with flowers. Maybe it's an adjunct.
You mean this part is an
Yeah.
adjunct? Yes, that's for sure, but it's an adjunct of what?
Instrument.
It's an
means?
instrument, that's more specifically true, but what is the name of the chunk
I don't know.
that you put together? All right, I think I'm going to short circuit things slightly by saying I'm really looking for something simple. All I was looking for was this chunk is a verb phrase.
Oh, okay.
That's all I meant. So we have a verb phrase that goes with to. It's missing something. Those are the things we can say so far, right? I will also help us out a little bit by saying what I already said earlier, that the thing which is missing is the topic. So what you can, to abbreviate, I can say a verb phrase, infinitival, missing I should say discourse topic. It's not the frame element topic. It's a discourse topic. Okay, we're getting somewhere. Now what do we do about this? The for me. Thiago?
Okay, this is actually a great example
Of language
because
mismatch,
we
or-
do study, and by we I mean myself and Ludmila and Adriele and Karina and Marcela.
Okay.
We do study a very similar construction in Portuguese. And in this construction, we do have a preposition for every single case. That is para, of course. And that's why probably, I don't know who said that there was a preposition to, because in Portuguese it would be a preposition.
Yeah, in Spanish too.
Yeah, and the fact is that you would not have such a clear formal distinction between the Brazilian Portuguese constructions because all of them would have para, and the difference is that either the subject is overt or not,
Right.
right? However, there are some sentences in which you cannot have the subject. So, for example,
Or should I give one in English?
yes,
Wait a minute. Now I suddenly don't remember how I do that.
well, for example, you could say in Portuguese, the room is easy for you to clean it, or for you to clean, you wouldn't have the last pronoun. O quarto é fácil para você limpar. Okay? But you wouldn't say something like, you would say, she is easy for you to please. Ela é fácil para você agradar. But you wouldn't say she's easy to please in the sense with para. You would use de. You wouldn't say ela é fácil para agradar. You would preferably say ela é fácil de agradar. So when you have para, you can have the for subject structure.
I see.
And when you have de, you just can't. And with para, in some circumstances in which the subject is clearly inferable, so it's more active or it's more intentional, okay? You can use para with infinitive without an overt subject. But when it's not so intentional, so active, then you just can't. So what we do have are semantic restrictions on the nature of the subject that would govern the preposition, the usage of the preposition. And in this last case, I would say that skills are the secondary topic. Because you have or are not secondary or primary, but another topic since you have me as a topic of the infinitival phrase. Or it's the subject and it's overt.
Okay, so Thiago has brought up some stuff which is certainly relevant for what we're talking about. So in this case, the me is definitely the subject. So we can indicate that it's the external of B here. Okay, so we certainly get that from what he said. And that also should make us think, well, what about this verb? What's the subject of that? So somebody who has a microphone out there, who is that right now? Okay. Can you characterize what would be what would I say if I were annotating FrameNet style? What would I say about the external argument of please, or take, or eat?
He says that maybe it is a new, constructionally new instantiation.
Absolutely, absolutely. And how would I interpret? This is the construction that's going to explain that null instantiation. So how would I interpret it? So remember, your two basic options are indefinite null instantiation and definite null instantiation. So which one is this?
Definite.
No.
Why no?
Because because what I mean when I say something like this is that it's general. It could be anybody, right? So if I say, she's easy to please, that means it's easy for me to please her. It's easy for you to please her. It's easy for them to please her. It's easy for somebody, people in general, to do it. So that's why it's indefinite, right? I don't have to have mentioned it, who the subject is, just before this. That's what definite null instantiation would be. Okay? Does that make sense?
Okay.
Okay. So now we have something to say about the subject here. How do we put that together with the information here? So I'll tell you, just because it's not obvious at what level I might be asking that question, that there is a general phenomenon in English where we have what you can call an infinitival sentence. Okay? And for every case of this, and we're not going to show this right now, but for every case of this, you can realize an infinitival subject as an infinitival verb phrase, which is has the external assigned to be indefinite. Okay? So this is a verb phrase whose external is indefinite, can be used anywhere where you can use an infinitive sentence in English. So in order to prove that, I would have to show you a ton of examples of different places where you can use this or this, and then show you that it works, but we have done that, and I'll just take that as background. So what that means is actually that it looked like we wanted to posit a 2 plus infinitival verb phrase, but actually we can be more general and say that we have an infinitival sentence which can be realized as a verb phrase with omission of the subject and that subject assigned as an indefinite. Just to give you some idea of why I would say it that way, let's consider for a moment the imperative construction, right? So in the general case, I have things like I went to Xanadu, but I can also say go to Xanadu. And I want to say, in this case, that both of these are examples of sentences, right? In terms of their distribution, they appear where whole sentences appear. So that's what we would call the external syntax. Meaning, what place does this whole chunk fit into? It fits into the place a sentence would fit. But in order to call both of these a sentence, I have to have, which is unusual for English, although not for Portuguese, a licensing of the omission of the subject. And so then I posit an imperative construction which says that one way that I can make a sentence is to have a verb phrase in the bare form. So the head of it should be in a bare form. And the external is assigned to be second person. Okay, so this is you see that this is a very similar kind of thing. I mean, it's different in that I'm assigning specifically to a second person, but in terms of the idea of having a construction that allows you to use a verb phrase where you otherwise would expect a sentence while assigning the role of the external is the same across these two. By the way, you know, some people have proposed that these are representations of one kind of construction, a subject omission construction. You could do that, but there wouldn't be a lot which was in common between them. And if we generalize that far, then we would do exactly what I said we shouldn't do for the following reason. So what would the structure be? The structure would be any sentence, I can have a verb phrase whose external is assigned to something. Right? I mean, that's what I'm generalizing to here. So for one thing, we already see we sort of have a question mark here. What's the supercategory of second person and indefinite? There's not really any clear supercategory for that. So I just have a question mark. So it's already sort of unclear what I could generalize to. The only thing I could generalize to is something. Maximally general, right? That's the only thing that would include all of that. But if I have this, then that would predict that in English, I can say broke his leg. Right? There's nothing in this construction specification that would exclude saying that. I will point out that actually in some dialects you can say that, but it's only possible to say that with certain persons and under certain conditions. In other words, this would still not be proper because it would predict that I could say this anytime, that I could use this kind of sentence anywhere, always. So that's what I mean when I talk about overgeneration. Okay? So that if we generalize that far, we have generalized too far. So we should stick to our two separate constructions, one that looks like this, and another one similar, which looks like that. Now cognitively, I will point out that cognitively, of course, there is some structure in common here, and we know that whenever you have structure in common, that something happens in the brain to connect those two things up. But that is what we call motivation. And that's different from describing how a construction actually works and how you put it together. And I suppose I should do a time check. What's that? 10:15. Okay. Let's finish out this construction then. So now, I'll tell you that we can generalize this to a sentential infinitive, or sorry, an infinitival sentence, which is missing an external argument. Which is missing a topic. And which is reassigned to be the external argument of the whole construction. Let's not do it that way. Right, so the topic which is missing here is identified with the overall subject of the clause. Okay, we are almost done. This looks pretty good. But if I leave it at this level, we will be overgenerating and undergenerating, both of them. So first of all, I will point out that I can say a sentence like the following. A woman easy to please is good to find. Okay? It's not exactly a common structure in English, but it's completely possible, totally within bounds of stuff you would find, especially in a novel, or somebody who is quirky like myself. Now what's the structure? So it's just the same as what we had before, except that this part, the verb to be, is not there. Okay? And the relationship between woman and easy is now one of a modifier, right? So in that case, the whole thing forms a predication. In this case, the chunk that seems to be, within the bounds of our construction, the whole thing forms a subject of some, with this part modifying that part. To explain this part, we have to, again, look at the rest of the language and sort of like a cooking show, I'm going to take that completed construction out of the oven with all the cooking that we did in order to determine that, off screen. So in this cooking show of this class, I present to you the fact that almost all adjectives can alternate between being predicative and attributive. We talked about this before. And this is no different. So the idea is that we have one adjective easy, and this adjective easy just says, in its most basic description, it says, I have an external argument. But there's another construction that says that unless there is some other specification, and you do have to do that, and we'll talk about that if you want, but there are some adjectives which are only attributive, some adjectives which are only predicative, and we're not going to worry about that complication for the moment. But in general, what you can say is that you take the external argument of an adjective, and you have a construction that takes whatever the adjective phrase is. So this one is an adjective phrase that's missing an external. And here, it's turned into an adjective phrase that's looking for a head. And you semantically identify these two things. Okay? So this is a little very general construction. Lets you turn adjectives that are looking for subjects into adjectives that are looking for heads. Easy then finds its head right here. There's another construction that puts heads together with modifiers. Easy slots into it. Everything works great. And then you can generalize over these two things by basically leaving this part out and saying that this external property is actually part of the adjective. Okay? So the adjective is looking for an external. This is also going to help us out if we have an imperative sentence like be easy to find, which is a direction I might give to a spy or something like that, It's a weird kind of direction, but the language supports it. So I generalize to that. There's one more thing I'd like us to say about this construction before we go to the break. And I'm going to narrow it down by saying we've done everything that we need to do, except we know that not all adjectives can do this. So now our question is this construction lexically specific or semantically specific? So obviously, if I take an adjective like red, you know, R-E-D, then there's no way it's going to work here. That's just impossible. So it's at least, it's one or the other of those, right? The category adjective is too general. So what is the category? Well, I'm going to have people speculate. So who has the microphone at this point? Pass. So can you figure, just to think, the easy way to do this is to think about other adjectives that work. So I've only given you hard, ready, and easy. Are there some other adjectives that can do this? And you can give them to me in Portuguese. I think that this part of the construction works the same. And Thiago confirms.
Maybe adjectives that means state of affairs.
What do you mean by that? So it's the adjectives reference a state of affairs. So this whole infinitival sentence is a state of affairs, and you're certainly talking about that. So that's a good first restriction. So we'll leave it at that. Hold on for just a second. So basically, I want an adjective that has some role, a frame element, which is, I'll put that in there, an adjective who has a frame element that is of type state of affairs. Okay? That's definitely true. If we don't have a state of affairs in the list of roles of the adjective, it's never going to do this. But let's choose another example. Okay, here's an example that looks like it might be the same construction, but it isn't. So taking an adjective like smart, it does allow you to have a complement of this kind. But if I try to do the other stuff that the construction tells me to do, first of all, note that she is actually the subject of tell me that. And so it's actually raising construction. It's not the same construction as this one. And when we try to use it in the same construction, so she is smart to please, this is terrible. I'm actually going to put a star in front of this because I cannot think of any possible interpretation. Okay, so she is smart to please. Just doesn't make any sense. Okay, so that's a good first restriction. We need that one, but what else do we need? So pass the microphone. And like I say, you really can just come up with examples, other adjectives that will work. That's probably easier than trying to think from first principles, right?
I thought maybe the adjective good.
Okay, good. That's a good one. You can give me some more, or you could pass the mic.
Yeah, I just thought good, so I will pass.
Okay, go for it.
We have a heart. Então é como a de inglês, heart. And also ready. Ready as an adjective in the other sentence. The second and the third. Ready.
Okay, so certainly we have ready. Okay, so here's our list of adjectives so far. Anybody, you have an idea for another?
Não, em português. Eu não tinha pensado...
I thought about in other examples, but actually, regarding the questions, I think that the adjectives in these constructions are predicative because they are a kind of complement, something like that.
They're predicative, but they can also be used. Sorry, I guess I erased the example, but they can be used as modifiers. So if I say something like, bacon ready to eat is what I want. Right, and then it's not actually predicative in that case. So they do have to be adjectives that can be predicative, that's for sure. Okay, can you pass? Can you come up with some other words that you could use? So just think about, think about this as a little blank. Put some other words in there. And like I say, Portuguese, you can change it to Portuguese and do the same. So it might be easier to think of things that are like this. What's something else which like it?
Legal? Ela é legal de conversar.
Okay, cool. Okay.
Ele falou ruim. Ruim.
Okay, sure. The opposite is obvious. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to help you out, and because we need to take a break pretty soon. So some other things that you could put in here are fun. You could also put in something like interesting. To summarize, you can put almost anything which is what in FrameNet terms is called stimulus subject. So anything which is an emotional reaction in which you are profiling the stimulus. So anything which is like that, you can use in this construction. But that doesn't describe all of these, right? So not everything in here is a stimulus subject. So this one, this one, this one in general terms, this one, this one, this one, but not hard, ready, or easy. That is another category, which is about enablement. So the other category is adjectives that cover the enablement of the state of enablement of some thing. So hard is about, well, is it enabled by things in general, or is it not? And ready is about, is it enabled by time specifically? Okay? So that actually means we need two constructions. Because if I tried to generalize any more, I would start to include things that don't actually occur. Okay? Thiago.
Just a question. In fact, if you take an adjective like red, and you modify it with an intensifier, at least in Portuguese, you could use it in this construction. You could say, those pants are too red to use, to wear.
Yeah, so
okay.
I would use a different construction to explain that.
All right, but...
and in fact, I would pin that on the TOO specifically. Because if I said very as a different degree modifier, it wouldn't be possible.
Well, it would be in Portuguese.
I see.
That's my question.
In English, it's not.
You could say, essa calça é muito vermelha para usar.
Yeah, impossible in English.
Okay?
Yeah.
If you think about Hey Start singers. There is a band in Brazil, Ridiculous, that uses colorful. So, but what I'm saying is that, and I'm saying that because that was my analysis before, we do have two constructions in the case of raising, but I wouldn't posit more than one construction, at least for Portuguese, for all the cases there, And I think the main difference is that when the adjective is encoding a quality that is not relative to anything, then you cannot put it in this construction. So you cannot say this lettuce is green to eat, because lettuce is inherently green. It's not relative to anything. But if you say that this lettuce is too green to be put in the salad, you know, then it's possible because greenness is relative to a purpose, which is putting it in the salad.
So I would say that that does fit in general terms into the enablement category. So certainly sufficiency, if there is a construction that allows you to interpret a degree modifier like vary as a sufficiency, then sufficiency is about enablement, and it does fit into one of the categories that I have here. I think the difference is that in English, vary does not allow you to have a sufficiency interpretation. And given that it doesn't allow sufficiency interpretation, you cannot use it in this case.
But would you... Is that working? Okay.
It is, yeah.
Would you think, or would you say that it's impossible to create a more general category for the adjectives that would be relative qualities, in fact? Because when you have both enablement or stimulus, it's relative to some subject.
You mean that there is some...
I would say
I think you would have to be amazingly careful. You would have to be really, really careful about how you do it. So it might be possible. You know, I'm not going to say that it's impossible. But what I would say is that for any very simple description, it's not going to work. So there might be a complex thing in which you generalize over perceivers and actors, but then I would be afraid if you have something which is so general as generalizing over perceivers and actors, that it would be so general that it would include everything.
I understand.
So again, if you were sufficiently careful, it might work. But I don't know what it would look like if you did that. Okay?
Yeah.
All right.